Hello again and welcome to episode 3 of our lecture 5 on civic ecology praxis. So in episode 3 we will discuss, as I mentioned earlier, a case study involving a small watershed community in South Central Texas in the United States. And I hope that in this case study I can illustrate civic ecology in action or the application of the principles and practices discussed in previews in this lecture today. So again, this lecture 5, the last lecture in the series of lectures on civic ecology, has been structured in 3 parts. In part 1, we discussed an important component of civic ecology practices, which I call collaborative inquiry. In part 2, we gave some brief describe briefly some characteristics of what is known as adaptive management. And in this episode 3, I will discuss briefly a case study. As I mentioned, the case study occurred in this small community, a small urbanizing watershed in South Central Texas. We have pictures here showing the beautiful creek that drains this watershed. A civic ecology project was initiated by local stakeholders to protect water quality and restore ecosystem integrity or ecosystem health. So as you can see, this seems to be a very appropriate context for civic ecology to succeed because instead of approaching a community, we at the university, Texas State University, were approached by the local stakeholders which were concerned about water quality and watershed issues. This project was facilitated by the River Systems Institute, which is our primary watershed-based research institute at Texas State, through the International Center for Watershed Science, also for Watershed Studies, also at Texas State, and financed by grants from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This project is located in Hays County, in the Edwards Plateau in Texas. Hays County is one of the counties that is at the moment experienced great growth, great urban development, and therefore is putting tremendous pressure on natural resources and watersheds in the region. In this watershed, the watershed is relatively small. It covers an area of about 98.4 square kilometers. And within that watershed, there is a small community with about 2,700 people. Precipitation in the area varies between 846 to about 944 millimeters. And this is what we call in hydrology a spring-fed stream. What I mean by that is that groundwater provides 92% of stream flow. In other words, there is a spring flowing to the river and maintain what you can see here as this continuous flow. Otherwise, the flow would be perennial. So runoff, the surface flow, the runoff contribution to stream flow is relatively small in this watershed. There are many watersheds of this type in South Central Texas in the Hays County. And they are all experiencing some type of problem associated with regional aquifer impacts affecting local watersheds. As I mentioned, these are small watersheds, they are spring-fed, and therefore, as the demand for water increases due to large cities in Texas, they increase water pumpage. And by pumping more water from groundwater aquifers, they will lower water table. And the consequence of lowering that water table is to promote that the springs will dry, and therefore flow will cease in the streams. So the rapid development of urban areas depend greatly on groundwater supplies in Texas. And as a result, the continued drilling of personal and public supply wells are causing tremendous problem to groundwater resources in the area. And most importantly, there is a lack of adequate legal jurisdiction for managing development in rural and semi-rural areas. So there is no restriction about the number of wells that can be drilled in the area. So this can cause tremendous problem to water resource, to groundwater resource in Texas. Now, to ensure that the long-term integrity and sustainability of the watershed is preserved and that water quality standards are maintained for present and future generations was the primary goal of this project. This goal was based on a core belief that good water quality is essential to all, and watershed protection is an individual as well as governmental responsibility. So as you can see, this is a context very favorable for civic ecology action because there is a consensus, or at least most of the stakeholders believe on the individual as well as governmental responsibility in maintaining watershed health and water quality. There was also, among the stakeholders in Cypress Creek, a recognition that the balance between growth and protection is needed to ensure watershed health. With this in mind, we developed our Civic Ecology project, which was conceptualized in two phases. Phase one, which ran from 2008 to 2010, and I will, in this brief presentation, present essentially the conclusions from phase one. And then phase two, which is now in the last year, is from 2011 to 2013. The goal of phase one was essentially to set a process in motion to create opportunities to develop what they call a watershed protection plan. A watershed protection plan is a document collaboratively developed to manage water quality and protect or enhance watershed health. In phase two involves essentially the development and implementation of this plan. We conceptualize each phase in two different subphases. In phase one, we conceptualize divide in two subphases, an assessment subphase and a reflection and visioning subphase. The goal of the assessment phase was essentially to answer the question, where are we now? Was in an assessment of the biophysical, social, institutional conditions, current conditions prevailing in the watershed. Once that phase was concluded, we moved to a reflection or visioning phase where we essentially developed tools to attempt to answer the question, where do you want to be? Phase two involves also two subphases, which, as you can see, are consistent with the notions of adaptive management. One is an action phase, which essentially attempt to respond to the question, how do we get there? And a most important subphase or learning phase where attempts to answer the question, how do we know if we are getting there? In the assessment phase, we basically first compiled, analyzed, and characterized surface and groundwater resources to assess water quality trends and identify potential areas of non-point source pollution. We also identified categories of stakeholders, who are the landowners, who are the county and regional representatives, state and federal agencies involved in the management of water resources in that watershed, business and industry representatives, citizen groups, community organization, etc. Why is this important? This is important because, again, civic ecology practice is based on a stakeholder process. It's supposed to bring to the table a group of stakeholders to discuss a direction, a vision, to create a vision, to develop a plan and implement that plan. So the goal, therefore, is that that group of stakeholders be well represented or representative of all types of stakeholders in the watershed. That's why we need to know before we start the project or in the intervention, we need to know who are the major players, who they are, to make sure that they are invited and participate in the process. And finally, during the assessment subphase, we initiate a process to identify and engage stakeholders through various forums, workshops, interactions with the community, through public meetings and special events. In the second subphase of phase one of the project, the reflection visioning subphase, we develop a computer-based decision support system for scenario analysis and decision making. This is very important tool for establishing, creating a vision upon which, a common vision upon which the stakeholders can work. The goal of this decision support system, which use what we call mediated or participatory modeling, which again, I want to remind you here that civic ecology practice is not a technocratic process, it's a participatory process. So traditionally, on a more technocratic approach, the issue of modeling is usually handled, resolved at the expert level. So the experts will always recommend what they believe to be the most appropriate type of model. As we are going to discuss at the end, this may cause some problems of acceptance by stakeholders. So in a civic ecology project, the modeling process is handled differently. We usually do modeling through a participatory or mediated process, which I mean is the stakeholders have an opportunity to work with the modelers to conceptualize and develop the model. I am not implying here that stakeholders should be able to know complex mathematical equations, programming. What I'm saying is that the issues to be addressed, the components to be built into the model is up to the stakeholders because they are more aware of the issues and concerns they want to address in the modeling process. And once that model is in place, that model is used to determine preferred future states to a process of scenario development and collaborative decision making. This figure here is a graphical attempt to show you the entire civic ecology project with the 4 phases and respective subphases. At the top here, we have the assessment phase, and as I mentioned before, the main activities that took place during this assessment phase was stakeholder identification and assessment of the watershed, biophysical conditions, and also an assessment of all state and federal agencies involved in the process. Once that phase was completed, and I want to mention here that in this assessment phase, the work is done essentially by the experts because the goal here is to put together all the available information and to bring them to the decision makers, to the stakeholders in a way that they can educate themselves and be better informed about the issues of their concern. So once that assessment phase was completed, so we moved to the next phase, the reflection phase. And during that reflection phase, the main activities that took place was 1, identification of goals, 2nd, identification of alternative options to address the goals, and when necessary, identification of research needs. Sometimes we were confronted with situations for which we still didn't have enough research, so some research needs were identified. That completed the sub-phase called reflection, and then we moved to the action phase, which is the first subphase of the phase 2 of the project, which is already completed. The primary activities during the action phase was the development the development of scenarios using the decision support system, the model that was developed and conceptualized to participatory collaborative inquiry, and then also develop a vision and a process of collaborative or dialogical decision making. So the outcomes of the action phase were an action plan, policies and programs to be implemented, management strategies, as well as instruments to assure the success of the project. Once that action phase was completed, we moved to the last phase, which is a very important phase, the learning phase. In the learning phase, there are 3 important activities involved. One is start with the implementation of the plan. Then there is monitoring to assure that the project is reaching its goals, and an evaluation. So the outcome of the learning phase will probably affect identification and identify the needs for adjustment during the reflection phase, which will itself initiate a new action phase, which in its turn will result in more learning. So as you can see, one characteristic of civic ecology projects, which makes it very different from traditional approach, is the circularity. So management is not a process defined in a time span. Management is seen here as an ongoing process. It's like managing a watershed is like managing our own lives. It's an ongoing process in which we are continually experimenting, continually make adjustment to our objectives. So more specifically, the civic ecology project is like a spiral, because when you complete a cycle, you never end the cycle at the point you started. So this is an ongoing project. So phase 1 here, as I said, was a 6-year project, and we are now in the last year, and hope that the community will find enough funds to continue this very important project. Some lessons learned from phase 1, and that also are relevant not to this particular project, but to civic ecology projects in general, is that first, strong leadership is critical to bring people together and to maintain the momentum of civic ecology projects. As I mentioned in this lecture, civic ecology project is a demanding project. It requires the engagement and participation of the stakeholders. It requires them to take time from their busy daily lives to come to meetings, to participate in workshops, and be parts of the process. For this to succeed, for the momentum of this process to be maintained, is very important the presence of local leadership, because are the local leaders who will motivate the stakeholders to come and participate in the process, be engaged in the decision-making, implementation, evaluation, in summary, all phases of the process. Another important lesson from this project, which simply reinforced, which I already said, which is one of the assumptions built into civic ecology practice, is the fact that mediated or participatory modeling increase citizens' perception of the model's legitimacy and utility for planning and decision-making, as opposed to, as I mentioned, traditional technocratic approach in which a model is presented to the stakeholders, a model developed by a group of models, and a model of which the stakeholders know very little. As they don't know much about the model and they don't understand what assumptions are built into the development of that model, one consequence is the model won't gain legitimacy and won't be seen as a utility for the planning and decision-making process. And finally, the scenario analysis that came out of the different simulations, simulating different climate environments, as well as different urban development strategies, improved dramatically the citizen understanding of the dynamics of the watersheds and facilitated the development, a common vision in the process of decision making. In conclusion, I would like to present here some references, some that were mentioned during the lecture. One of the authorities in the field of adaptive collaborative management is Dr. Armitage, and I have two of his works here, presented here. One is a paper published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, published in 2009. And another one is a book called Adaptive Collaborative Management. I mentioned that most of the work on collaborative inquiry was developed by British social scientist John Heron, and I have here one of the classic papers where he introduced the concept in 1996. Also, we use complex adaptive systems as the theoretical basis for civic ecology praxis. And one of the classic papers that describes the complex, unpredictable, uncertain nature of social ecological systems is a paper by one of its major proponents, Crawford Stanley Harling, paper published in 2001. The diagram that I presented here that was used to conceptualize the Civic Ecology project at the Cypress Creek watershed in South Central Texas was a modification of an earlier diagram presented by Dr. Lau and her collaborators in 2001. And finally, there have been many papers published by John Heron and Peter Reason on the subject of collaborative inquiry. But I thought that the Handbook of Action Research, edited by Reason and Bradbury, is a better reference here because it brings together, it kind of summarizes all the previous work. In summary, to finish these lectures, I want to tell you that it was my pleasure to have the opportunity to share with you this exciting field of civic ecology. I also want to understand that there are many community-based approaches to sustainability already implemented all over the world with different names. So civic ecology is a name that I call this type of approach, which has some characteristics, but share many similarities with other existing community-based approaches already in place. And finally, I would like to mention a quote by Margaret Mead, attributed to her. When we think about the scale and the complexity of the global problems, this capitalism and the consumerism prevailing in the industrial nations, we may feel pessimistic with relation to the little impact that communities can have on the attainment of more just and sustainable society, a sustainable society. But I would share my thinking with Margaret Mead. I would never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you very much.